The purpose of this workflow is to take an image, and that image could be a contract, it could be an invoice, it can be a lease, and pull the data from it so that we can manipulate it or store it somewhere. In our case, it's going to be Google Sheets. So I'm going to walk you through how you can take an invoice that is sent to you as a JPEG or a PNG, extract the data from it, and then store it into Google Sheets. So two things first before we actually do a walkthrough of each node. I want to show you the invoice. And so this invoice was created in a Word doc, and then I just took a screenshot of it. I'm going to explain why later. It's very important. And then as you will see here, we have two invoices in our Google Sheet. So we have invoice number 1, number 2, and it's broken down. Did a line item of each thing that was, each task that was performed or billed for. And you'll see in our folder that we just have invoice 1 and invoice 2, and then our list of invoices. So I'm going to go ahead and demo this for you. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to drop invoice 3 into our folder, and then we'll watch for the workflow to execute. And there it is, success. So you'll see here that we got invoice number 3. We have 3 line items. And then we have the date, invoice number, due date, who the invoice was issued to, the description of each line item, the quantity of each line item, and the price of that. And then you'll see here that we have an email, and it says invoice sent, received, invoice, hello, Mr. Gear, great news, we sent out another invoice, and it has all of the invoice details that we wanted to send by email with a breakdown. And then we did the math for the total, and then let them know the date the invoice was sent out. So that's the workflow in a nutshell. Now let's go ahead and walk through each node so you can better understand how it works. Now I'm going to do this in the execution view here. And the reason for that is because I do have a node, and I'll explain more when we get to it, that doesn't send through any sort of repeat data or existing data. And so we're not going to be able to see that in the editor. So we'll just go ahead and walk through everything in this execution view. So the trigger here is the Google Drive folder, and it checks every minute, I believe, and you can adjust this to whatever works best for you. But what it's doing is it's looking for changes, a file created. So it's looking for a change, which is a new file being created and added to this folder. And so the workflow for this might be somebody receives, an email with an invoice, and maybe they're not the one to process that invoice. And so they just drop it in a folder, or maybe they used to process the invoices, but now they don't have to, and they just drop that in the folder and let it go. Of course, you can change this to something else. It could be an invoice sent over Slack, or it could be an invoice sent by email. This can definitely be changed to fit whatever your current workflow is. And so now that the trigger, or now that it has been triggered, the next step is to search the folder. And what it's going to do is it's going to search for a file type with a PNG, and we're looking in the folder or looking in the invoices and automations folder. And then what it's going to do here is that it's actually going to return everything that's in the folder. So we only sent through invoice 3, but it's also sending through invoice 1 and 2. This ended up creating a problem later on for me, which I'll explain here in a second. Now, the next step is that we're going to download these. Every file that has a PNG in it, we're going to download it. So you'll see that we have invoice 1, 2, and 3. And then we have the different invoices that came through. So invoice 3, which I showed you a second ago. Then we have invoice 2, which is different, different name, Mark Smith. And then invoice 1, Richard Sanchez, and different line items and so on. And so what we're going to do here now that we have these is we're going to run it through an HTTP request. And this one in particular taps into free OCR. And so what this does is that this is what pulls the text from an image so that you can parse it and use it however you want. Now, I'm not going to walk you through how to create an account and get your API. If you have any questions, though, let me know in the comments and I'll do my best to help you out. And so I'll just go ahead and walk you through the settings here real quick. So for the method, chose post, the URL for the OCR, and then in the header, we have the API key and the key itself. And then we have the body content type. Here we selected n8n binary file for the name, and then data, which is from the name here. And then what that does is that it pulls the data out, and what you get is just a big block of raw data in, I'm not really sure how to phrase it. It just comes through structured however the invoice is laid out. And this is one of the things that I was referring to earlier on when I said that I used Word and took a screenshot of it. And the reason being is you'll see here, like we have invoice number 3, date, and the date's there. We have the due date, issued to, and the name, and the company, address. And you'll see that everything is very, very clean, and it's structured in a way that makes sense. So, invoice number, and you expect to see the invoice number after the heading there. Now, depending on the template you're using or how you have your invoice or your contract structured, you might find that you have invoice number, and then it's not the invoice number that follows that. It's the date, or it's maybe another heading like quantity or description, and it doesn't follow a logical order. And the problem that you run into with that is that when you go to actually use regex, which is I'm not sure if it's really a script or code, but it's a way to create and spot patterns in a block of text so that you can actually pull out the data that you want to use. And so when you have an invoice that's not structured in a logical way, it's very difficult for the regex to find the actual data you want. So like if you have regex saying, I want to look for invoice number, and I'm oversimplifying how that works, but it's, if you have regex that says, I want to find invoice number, you want it to basically look for that, wait a couple spaces, the colon and the space here, and then pull the invoice number. But if you have invoice number and say like date or due date immediately following it, it makes it really difficult to write regex in such a way that allows you to consistently pull the data that you want. And so for the purpose of this tutorial, I created an invoice that is structured very logically and in such a way that just makes it easy for regex to pull the data. If you have an invoice or contract or whatever, whatever type of document you're trying to pull data from, and it's not structured in a logical way, I think there are like 2 choices here. You're going to either mess around with regex for a long time, and you still may run into issues if that document just isn't consistent each and every time that it runs through your workflow, or you change how you do invoices and change it to such a way like this to where it's structured in a very logical way that makes it easy to extract and parse the data that you want. So something there just to keep in mind. So for this particular node, what ended up happening is we're pulling all 3 items. So we have the invoice details for 3, or excuse me, where's the invoice number? Invoice number, yep. So 3, 2, and 1. And this other data here isn't anything that we need to use. And so what we're going to do next is we're going to run all of this through a code node. And this is where we're going to have our regex. Now for this, I did this in 2 steps. So the very first step I did is I went to Ask AI and I said, this is the data that I want to pull. So I want to pull the invoice number, and I want to pull the date and the due date, and I want it structured in such a way that allows me to store all of this data into a Google Sheets file. Now, what I have found is that Ask AI gets me about 80% of the way there, and then I take the script that it has written for me and I take it to ChatGPT to take it over the finish line. And what you'll find here is a script that runs through this parse text. And a lot of it here is regex. That's what we see here. And that's what you see here for the date and the due date and the issue to. That's all regex. It's a way to find patterns in your parse text, your block of text, to help you find the data and pull the data that you want to use. And then you'll see here that we have invoice 3, invoice 2, invoice 1, and we have all the data in a very clean and structured format. Now, all of the data here goes into this merge node. Now, before I go into the merge node, I want to explain this Google Sheets here at the bottom, because what I was running into is I would drop, say I would have invoice 1 and 2 already in here, and then I would drop invoice 3. And I already had the data for invoice 1 and 2 in here, and then I didn't have any data for 3. What the workflow would do is it would drop, as soon as I dropped 3 in there and the workflow started, it would actually go through all of the existing files in there and return all of the data for it. So what I was getting was a lot of duplicate data. So what I did to fix that is I added a Google Sheets here. And what this does is it goes through and it pulls all of the existing data in the sheet while the rest of this workflow is executing. And so the data that's in this Google Sheet, because we haven't stored the data from invoice 3 yet. And so what we get back is invoice 1 and 2 and all of the data for those 2 invoices. And then what we do is we take all of the data from this code node, which was 1, 2, and 3, or invoices 1, 2, and 3. And we take the data from this Google Sheets here, which is 1 and 2, and we run it through this merge node. What's cool about this is we're combining all of the data, and we're going to match the fields. And what we want to match here is invoice number. And the idea here is that what we want to look for is unique data and non-unique data, because what I don't want is non-unique data making its way all throughout the workflow and then being added to the Google Sheets here, which just creates duplicates. And so what I have here is we're going to match the invoice number, and we're going to keep the non-matches from the code node and this Google Sheets node merging. And so since invoice 1 and 2 already existed, and you'll see here we have 1, 2, and 3, but since 1 and 2 already existed, we're only going to send through the ones that don't match or didn't already exist, which was invoice number 3. And so now we take the invoice number 3 data, and we're actually going to store that into Google Sheets. And this is really simple. We're going to I actually had this set up to map automatically because I believe I already had all of this set up before. So we had this to map automatically. It goes through and, invoice number is added to invoice number, invoice date, due date, issue to, and so on. And that wraps up that portion of the workflow. Now, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to take this aggregate data. I have this aggregate data because I don't think the data was coming through in such a way that was easy for me to pull because of how I have this broken down by line item. So you can see here, we have a lot of duplicate information. So like I have invoice 3, invoice 3, invoice 3, same invoice date, same due date, same issued to. Like the only difference here is the description. Most times the quantity or the description, quantity, and unit price is really what's going to be different from each line item. And so this aggregate node allowed me to break all of that apart because in the next step, when I send an email, I only want to have one invoice number. I only want to have one invoice date, one due date, because it's all the same for every line item. But I wanted to be able to break each line item down separately in the email, and this aggregate node allowed me to do that. And then what we're going to do is we're going to send all of this data through this AI agent, and we're going to give this AI agent the task of writing an email. Now, admittedly, when I created this workflow, I screwed up in that I was thinking about the workflow in terms of receiving an invoice, from somebody that I needed to pay. But I wrote the email in such a way that I was the one sending out the invoice. So ignore that. That's a bit of a user error. That's all on me. But I think there's still something to learn from there. So we're going to take all the data from this aggregate node, and you'll see that it's all separated here. And then we use for the text, I just did an expression for JSON data. So we have all of the data available to us. And then I created a system message. And I'll just go ahead and quickly walk you through that. The system role, you're an expert invoice assistant that extracts key information and formats it into an email for the business owner. Task specification, you will generate an email to Mr. Gear informing him that another invoice was submitted. And then I gave it a couple of rules. Now, in hindsight, I probably gave it too many rules to start. I would have started with fewer rules and then layered it on. And the reason being is that when you start out with so many rules for the AI agent from the outset, it makes it a lot harder to troubleshoot. But I ended up getting it. So, I mean, it worked out. But I think in hindsight, I would have started with far fewer rules for the AI. And then from here, at this point, I used some of the JSON data to include the breakdown of the invoice. And then I gave it an example of what I want the output to look like. Hello, Mr. Gear, great news. We sent another invoice. Here are the details. And then we have the invoice number with the JSON invoice number. And that allows us to grab, using the expression there, allows us to grab any invoice number that comes through, any invoice date, rather than a fixed invoice number and a fixed date, a fixed due date, and so on. And then from here, I had the AI help me write this in such a way that we get the total of the invoice done. We have all the math done for us and added to the email. And then we have the invoice date that it was sent out added to the bottom. And you can see here, I wrote this all in such a way, I wrote this in markup. That way it could spit out the email exactly the way I want it to look. And then we take all this information from the AI agent and we send it over to Gmail. And here is all the output. And all we had, all I had to do here was connect it to my Gmail account, add the subject line, the email type, which is HTML. And the reason why I did that was because I wrote the email in HTML. And then the JSON output, which is everything from the left side here. And then it gets sent through. And this is what it looks like. And that's all there is to this workflow. It's actually, like I said earlier on, it looks complex, I think, because there's a lot of nodes and a lot of little steps. And there are a couple nuances to this that'll make it, that might present a challenge as you build it out. But all in all, I think this is a pretty simple workflow that can save you a bunch of time each week, every month, depending on the number of invoices or contracts or leases or other documents that you might process currently by hand. So that wraps that up. I hope that helped. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments. If you have any feedback, you can leave those in the comments as well. I read and respond to every single one. Now, if you'd like to get a copy of this workflow, I make them available for free to all of my email subscribers. The way to sign up is to find the link to my website in the description. Click that, go over to my website, sign up to the email newsletter, and you will get an email at some point with a link to all of the workflows that I've built in the past with links to the corresponding YouTube videos. And that's it. Again, thank you for watching. Let me know if you have any questions or comments. Leave them below in the comment section, and I'll see you in the next one.